So I'm here to talk about Seeing Eye, which is a very kind, nice, warm introduction. We'll start with a trailer to the project, and then we'll get into it.
In this playground of immortality, the preservation of experience has taken hold of our existence. We're able to stay connected even when hiding from one another. The illusion of companionship without the demands of relationships. We choose to text rather than talk. Where we are but simulations, we cannot be ourselves. These simulations blur the lines between fiction and reality. And when they permeate back into our lives, they obscure the sense of ourselves and of one another. Where both spectator and spectacle inhabit this blurred reality, eroding individuality and the sanctity of consciousness. Because we've grown up with technology, we assume technology has grown up too. We're being isolated as it continues to progress. And as we've never been taught how to be alone, we only know how to be lonely. The distinction between physical reality and its simulation is blurring. And if our consciousness is experienced through the perception of sight and sound, through interaction, through technology, and through our conception of knowledge, to what extent is it really our own?
Next year, for 24 hours a day for 14 days, I'll wear a virtuality headset, only seeing and hearing what one person sees and hears for 2 weeks. This person, who we call the other and is a stranger to me, wear a custom-built recorder which records a 220-degree field of view left and right and 165 degrees up and down. This is because peripheral vision is 210 by 150, so we've got slightly more each way. And I'll wear this recorder for 24 hours a day for 2 weeks. I'll be in an exhibition space containing all the necessary facilities, a toilet, a double bed, an exercise bike, and a table and chair. And I'll eat whenever and whatever the other eats, and I'll have water to drink whenever I please. Otherwise, I'm free to do as I like, as long as the VR headset remains on. Much like me, the other is free to do as they wish, as long as their headband stays on and is recording every moment of their life. They're under strict instructions to live their life as normally as possible, considering the circumstances. So this means that they're a real-life person, not some crazy, skydiving, daredevil celebrity. No, they're a relatively boring, real-life human being, much as we all are, except they'll lead a very different life to mine. So we're currently in the process of trialling lots of different others, with our most recent trial run being at Ars Electronica in September this year, where I wore a VR headset for 9 hours a day for 7 days, where I experienced a different person's life each day. So we trialled a range of people, from an 18-year-old girl who got her A-level results the day before filming, to a 27-year-old male farmer, to a 71-year-old woman. At Ars Electronica, we also trialled working with a clinical psychologist who was monitoring me at all times, whilst I also wore a biometric harness which was developed by Ravensbourne University, which monitored my real-time movements, body temperature, heart rate, and galvanic skin response, my sweat, basically. All in all, it's a very successful trial run, an exhibition, and is leading us very well into next year for the real thing. So we're trialling different people at the moment, so we can come back to this in the conversation if we want to talk about it. But it's quite a short presentation, really, so I'd rather talk about the concepts of Seeing Eye rather than production and logistics of it. So at this point, I'd like to say a very special thank you to Arbeit Gallery, who have been the primary funders and supporters of Seeing Eye up until Ars Electronica, and also, along with a thank you to the Sundance Institute, Mindfulness Centre of Excellence, and Ravensbourne University for their support too. But so I'll be wearing a VR headset for 24 hours a day for 14 days. So I'll be unable to see my own hands or hear my own voice or have any human contact for the 2 weeks that this is taking place. Most importantly, though, I won't have any form of human interaction to act as a reference point to validate any questions, desires, or thoughts I may have, whilst the only stimulation being what the other sees, and their voice and actions being my constant narration. How will the lifestyle and personality of this other person start to affect my movements, mannerisms, personality, memory, but most importantly, my rationale, how I think? And what happens if over the course of the 2 weeks, I start to believe that I'm not just present, as we saw with Ars Electronica, but the reality that I'm experiencing is my reality, and that I start to believe that I am this other person? Even if momentarily, for 1 minute, I start to believe that I'm this other person, whose identity is it? Is it their identity, or is it my identity? Without agency to determine and shape who we are, will the notion of consciousness, my consciousness, be enough to counteract what I'm seeing and hearing for 2 weeks? Because fundamentally, I would argue that if you're able to condition and alter the way someone thinks, the way I think, then I would argue that you fundamentally change who that person is. And this is what I think happens in society. So the VR headset is a metaphor for the wider physical world. And in a very simplified way, this is how I see the world functioning. On the right-hand side of this is the internet, which the influence of which should never be ignored, both positively and negatively. And on the left-hand side of this is the real world, so to speak. And this is a very simple understanding of how I think the predominant social structures rule the majority of the collective's world and reality. So at the top of this, we've got the establishment. The establishment was a term used by Henry Fairley in the 1950s to describe how the elite networks at the top of British society closed down ranks to protect their own fundamental interests. So at the top of this, bankers and media, you could probably name a few other people, the economy, if you want to be a bit abstract with it. And then below, just above autonomy, I would place politicians and politics. And then you come to society, what we collectively deem to be socially acceptable. That's to say, the cultural and legal norms are the main influences on people's conduct and moral beliefs. Historically, the moral and ethical code of law has been dictated by the establishment. But over the last 100 years or so, we've started to see a shift in which what we, the collective of individuals, deem to be socially acceptable, beginning to feed into law. And we see this mostly with rights. We see this in growing women's rights, the civil rights movements, LGBTQ+ rights, amongst others. But one important thing to note about rights is the relationship between law and rights. Laws enable rights. And the core of any code of law is in the restrictions placed on attitudes, behaviours, and freedoms. Rights offer the ruling government. Rights offer the freedoms that the ruling government allow the individual to have. And in return, the individual is to be grateful for the privileges that they're offered. Whilst the potential of legal reform will always enable a perception of autonomy, legal reform being the renegotiations of the rights restricted on the individual. And then you come to education. And in school, we're taught the value of the winners in history, society, but more importantly, we're taught the structures through which we'll deem ourselves to be a success or failure. In the UK, we go to school from the ages of 4 till 18, and we're taught that during those years, that to succeed in our exams is tantamount to individual fulfilment. But these grades are standardised so that we must actively beat our peers in order to succeed, meaning we measure our own success against the failure of others. And this system is fundamentally built to determine and shape the expectation of the individual through a structure that needs both winners and losers to exist. And of course, the expectations we have of life are dictated by how we measure success. A male, working class, born in China has a very different set of ideological expectations than that of a woman born in Saudi Arabia, or a white, middle-class male born in the United Kingdom. But as the rigidity of social inequality is firmed, philosophical discourse will always be confused with success and individualism within a system that entrenches the individual above all else. And of course, this stems from a warped capitalist mentality bred through a neoliberal ideology, overlaid with a free market mentality that's been adopted by every society, nearly every society in the world, ensuring that wealth and power remain fixed and unequally distributed. So to use a somewhat extreme example to highlight the power of wealth, or the lack of it, on the 4th of August in 2011, in North London, a 29-year-old black man named Mark Duggan was shot and killed by the police as quite clearly wrongful and incorrect allegations of terrorism. Protests, which focused on Mark Duggan's shooting, along with how black people are treated by the police, were held in Tottenham Hale. And by the 6th of August, 2 days after the initial protests after Mark Duggan's wrongful killings, the protest had turned into riots. Over the next 9 days, the riots had spread across to other cities in England, and in London specifically, the police had lost control over the people. Boris Johnson, the then Mayor of London, responded to this by purchasing illegal water cannons with taxpayers' money as a means of, and I quote, ensuring future autonomy. So by the 15th of August, 11 days after the initial protest over Mark Duggan's wrongful killings, the riots had essentially come to a close. Nearly 4,000 arrests had been made, with 885 for disorder and 67 for arson. There were 5 deaths and at least 16 injuries. There was also an estimated £200 million worth of property damage. But for me, what stood out was that just under 2,300 people were prosecuted for theft. So what initiated out of political and ideological protest at the unjust murder of a young black man via collective individual power was turned into material gain and instant self-gratification. London lost sight of its motives and instead wreaked havoc in pursuit of that shiny new TV or new Air Force One trainers. So I can see why people call this a riot, but I call it a protest because it obviously was. It was made up of people predominantly from less wealthy backgrounds and council estates around London, and they were fed up. What originated out of frustration at being treated differently from other, more privileged people turned into theft. But what they were stealing were the signifiers of success and happiness that capitalism has their whole life told them to aspire to, and their whole lives they've been denied. The structure of protest exists as a means of displaying dissent, but it's only permitted by the government so long as 6 days' notice is given and a route and timescale is published. So what should be a proactive, self-validating, important civil action appears to merely be the illusion of empowerment. Because what options are made available to the public once protests have been approved and completed, but ultimately ignored? Riots are protests born from frustration at the decision and behaviours of those who hold governance and a lack of alternative recourse. Protests, and this kind of action, allow the public a vent for frustration, a show of self-worth, but when it's rooted in genuine emotion by a large enough collective of individuals, riots emerge due to a lack of alternative options, at which point frustration becomes aggression. And this frustration is directed at a system which takes values in objects which are fundamentally beyond the reach of those protesting, so the natural act of protest is to undermine that system. The act of stealing, in this instance, undermines consumerism. And in a system that determines your social order in part based on wealth, the gestural appearance of wealth is key. Because wealth is a signifier of success, and to show it is validation. Eating at restaurants which others can't afford to eat at is a gesture. So are your hobbies, interests, and choices made in your personal and professional life. Your culture, essentially, is a manifestation of your wealth. And this is where I think you begin, where I begin, where individuality is allowed to take place. Because individuality is evident to a degree in the choices we make with our money, but to make that show of affluence is something that's already been decided for us by the time we have the money to show off. Because by that point, we're so used to having been funneled down through such a linear path of life that the only real differences between you and I are aesthetic, surface-level divergences on cultural and political ideologies. This provides us with agency, but only within a parameter we're free to move within but never exceed, not that we have the power to exceed it on our own anyway. But this parameter of individuality, I would say, is really only over our tastes. The taste in the clothes and music we buy, our taste in which political party we support, or our slight slant in a historically Western Christian moral compass. Our individuality exists, but only within the shadows of society. So in 1952, a scientist called Claude Shannon made an artificially intelligent mouse which he called Thesis, in the hopes of demonstrating the possibilities of AI at that point. Thesis was an electronic mouse that would navigate its way to a pre-designated point. Once completed, if it was placed anywhere on that maze, it would remember the route and go back to that designated point. Now, I think it's a common misconception that Thesis, or indeed the programmer of Thesis, were the autonomous ones, because I don't think they were. It's the person who makes the maze and the person who decides to place thesis within the maze. Theses for movements are limited to left, right, forwards, and backwards, and is limited to what options are made available to it and acts accordingly to a set of pre-designated rules. Now, in the 21st century, how different are we to thesis? We're thrust into this world with our final destination already determined. We have the choice of which route we may take, but we don't make the decisions of what forwards and backward means, nor did we ever choose to get dropped into this maze. And linking this directly back to seeing eye and the VR headset, Wittgenstein teaches us that we assume that the physical world, as accessed by our senses, is the real world. The senses which are most readily accessed in day-to-day life are sight and sound. And this is where the notion of a VR headset as a metaphor for the wider physical world is rooted. We access the world presented to us in virtual reality by the same means that we access the physical world. And in this physically domesticated world, which has been artificially altered and curated to the needs of man, we all live in square boxes. We look out of our windows and see square gardens. Beyond our hedges, man has built every building, road, park, and field. Mechanically and physically, our audio-sensory experience have been engineered. From the creak of a floorboard to church bells ringing to an engine revving, none of this exists without man's influence. Even the sound and feeling of the wind that we feel is influenced by the man-made surroundings that we've built, and this is before we mention man's influence on the environment itself. So imagine a world in which we have no senses, in which we're deprived of sensation and unaware of our surroundings. We become numb to the world and numb to the fact that our experiences are fiction and simulated. We believe this fiction to be truth because it's the only experience we know, and at that point we assume that the physical world is the real world, and there the simulation becomes life. We submerge ourselves and surrender ourselves to manufactured sensory input, standing in Plato's cave, facing the wall and naming the shadows, oblivious to the fire outside. And then there's the other. Now, I always feel like I shouldn't talk too much about the other, as potentially vocalizing my conceptual thoughts on them could alter not only their behavior, but also whether they participate at all. But the idea of broadcasting your life is something that, whilst maybe scary on paper, is something we're moving to. And this is symptomatic of an erosion to privacy and anonymity we're seeing more and more, and a seeming rejection of something that we once thought of as a fundamental human right. And social media obviously has its part to play in this. And the appeal of social media is that it turns us all into celebrities and magnifies our desires for others to be impressed by or jealous of our lives. Celebrities have their data catalogued online for them by journalists and the like. But we have to do it ourselves, up to a point when people start taking our online activity, sharing it, quoting it, passing it off as their own even, and that's where these little endorphins start firing. Because we're not manufacturing a facsimile of digital fame at this point. It's something which we've cultivated, and it's self-perpetuating. But for the viewer on the other side, much like when we watch a film, we peer through the window into the protagonist's life. And for the 2 hours that we're watching the film, we suspend our disbelief. We trick ourselves to a certain extent that what we're seeing is reality. We watch the sequential moments of their lives documented and edited. But when documenting the real world, just as when we're being watched, we consciously and subconsciously consider our actions through the potential reception of our audience, which results in a particular social behaviour being entrenched. But when we understand and shape the world in our own somewhat distinct image, with each experience informing the next, as more and more of those experiences are shared with strangers and loved ones alike, it follows that there'll be an effect on how you process and remember those experiences in memories. Michel Foucault said, when the prisoner doesn't know when he's being observed, he becomes his own guardian. And I expect this to be the case with the other. When our identities and behaviours and conversations are played publicly, and every moment potentially seen by others, it only allows for conformity to political, social, and philosophical ideals, norms, and thought processes, as our individual experiences are no longer individual. So then very quickly, the notion of whether the other is performing arises, as they're no longer truly free in their action, as everything is being watched by me, an all-seeing and all-knowing stranger. But then the other is in control of my experience, what I'm thinking, what I'm doing, and ultimately my being. But I am the guardian, and I'm observing everything. But they're self-censoring because of it. So then we get stuck in this loop, which is fundamentally rooted in who is in control, the other or me. I constructed this reality but have surrendered all agency, whilst the other has full autonomy and is yet restricted by the potential acknowledgement of every action and conversation. So who is the autonomous one becomes at once entirely irrelevant as we both exist within our realities, alone but together. Whilst at the same time, who is the autonomous one becomes the fundamental question, is without agency, who are we? So to bring you to the final line of the trailer that we started with, if our consciousness is experienced through the perception of sight and sound, through interaction, through technology, and through our conception of knowledge, to what extent is it really our own? Thank you.